Everyone laughed when the old farmer spent his last dollar on a pile of rusted metal. They called him crazy, until one stormy night changed everything. What he built on that lonely ridge would bring light back to an entire valley and turn mockery into legend. Subscribe now and hit the bell. You won't believe how this story ends. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? The valley had a way of teaching people to expect nothing new. Seasons turned like an old wheel with missing teeth. Rain arrived either late or all at once. Gossip took the place of news. Mornings broke pale and unhurried over low hills that held the fog like a secret, and by noon the same two trucks would pass the same three porches, their drivers trading the same jokes as last year. It was a place that lived off habit, a place that mistook quiet for peace. From the kitchen window of his farmhouse, Elias Marlowe could see the one thing that did not fit. A skeletal wind turbine on the ridge above his fields, its paint long since scoured away, its blades frozen in a permanent shrug. Crows had made a home in its hollowed body. On certain gusty nights the tower moaned, a sound too human to ignore. People called it the Tower of Dead Wind, the last survivor of a row the county raised 2 decades ago with speeches about clean power and prosperity. The money ran out, the engineers left, and the towers were given to weather and rumor. Elias watched it every morning as he drank his coffee, the habit older than the dents in his enamel mug. He had been a farmer long enough to be carved by the land's patience, wind-swept wrinkles, sun-bleached eyes, a back more honest than any ledger. His wife's voice had once bounced through the house like light. His son's footsteps had once rattled the stairs. The years took them away. Her to illness that said little but took everything. The boys to distant cities that glittered with opportunities he couldn't argue against. What remained were rows of wheat, a dog with a slow tail, and silence that did not know when to stop. The grid that stitched power across the valley was more mythology than infrastructure. Every storm snapped a line somewhere. Every snap meant candles and an ache in the eyes by bedtime. Elias had collected kerosene lamps, learned the angles of their light on a book's page, learned to wait out the dark. But outages had grown longer in recent seasons. Laziness calcifying into policy at a county office he rarely visited. Somewhere between the burn of a cold blue dawn and the wait of a final evening without radio or fridge, a small thought took root. If no one else cared to keep the valley breathing, perhaps the wind still did. The rumor that the county planned to dismantle the last tower for scrap arrived at the feed store like a fresh crate of nails, handled, turned over, judged, and joked about. "About time they tore down those eyesores," a man said, spitting neatly into a can. "Good steel, though. Might pave us a new parking lot." Another laughed, the sound bright and shallow. Elias waited for the laughter to thin, then asked where the auction would be. A hush lasted 3 heartbeats. Then the room broke like a pond struck by a stone. "What, you buying a fan for your porch, Marlowe? You going to scare the crows with it? Tell us when it lifts your tractor into the sky." He paid for his feed without answering. The jokes followed him out the door, thin and satisfied. He drove home with his window down and the wind cold against his jaw. The tower on the ridge leaned as if listening. At the auction yard the next afternoon, the sun had a metallic taste. Tower sections lay in the dust like bones. The nacelle was streaked with streaks of rust as dark as dried blood. The auctioneer's voice climbed and dropped over numbers that went nowhere. Men in caps and mirrored sunglasses weighed pieces with their eyes. calculating how many torches and hours each lot would consume. When the wind generator from Marlow Ridge came up, the auctioneer read the card as if it were an apology. Lot 32, wind generator, 40 meters, condition, scrap. Opening bid, $50. Silence. A fly buzzed the microphone. Somewhere a chain clinked. Elias lifted his hand. It was not bravery. It was posture, the setting of shoulders he'd set 1,000 times before plowing through drought. The auctioneer's gavel came down as if a reprieve had been granted. Sold to Mr. Marlowe. Laughter followed in polite waves, relieved to have a punchline. Elias nodded once. He didn't look at the faces. The wind tugged at his shirt as he walked back to the truck. It took 3 days and 2 favors to arrange transport. The drivers who arrived were younger men with eyes that held a certain practiced skepticism. They strapped the blades with the care of people handling trouble. "You sure about this, old man?" one asked, not unkindly. "That thing's nothing but rust and regret." "She's still standing," Elias said. "That's enough for me." The convoy crawled up the dirt road to his farm at the speed of doubt. Children ran alongside until their parents yelled. Women stood on porches with dishcloths in their hands. By the time the trucks reversed beside the old silo and the tower sections thumped the ground, word had traveled the length of the valley. Elias Marlowe had bought himself a dead windmill. They left him with a hill of iron. Dust hung in the air like a thought that wouldn't settle. Someone on the road called, "Building a spaceship, Marlowe." The joke lost its echo before it reached the hedgerow. Night came with a frayed edge. Elias sat by the window, lamp sputtering, and watched the silhouette of the metal against a sky that refused to go fully dark. The fields were still. Even the crickets hesitated. A small movement took him from chair to door, from porch to dirt, from dirt to the mound of parts. He laid his palm on the nacelle's skin. The steel was rough, pitted like old bread, stubborn beneath his touch. Beneath that stubbornness was something else, a trace of warmth, holding on from the day, the slightest suggestion that metal remembered the sun. He nodded once to no one. The night answered with wind in the grass. Morning brought the ordinary chores: feed, water, fences. He finished them with a measured impatience, then shouldered tools and walked the slope toward the ridge. Work began at the edges. Weeds cut back, vines torn free, bolts coaxed with oil and heat. He discovered mice nests that collapsed into sour dust, birds' gifts of twine and glitter. He moved slowly because slowness was the only speed that kept pain from blooming too fast in his hands. Trucks slowed on the road. Some passengers waved with that particular friendliness reserved for fools. Others shook their heads as if a man could be argued out of his own stubbornness by the weight of a stranger's disappointment. In town, laughter found its old rhythm. At the diner, a joke grew legs. Someone should charge admission to Marlowe's show. At the feed store, a chalkboard sprouted a tally named "Days Till the Wind Gives Up." Elias did not visit the places where laughter had chairs reserved for him. He went instead to the ridge every morning and returned from it every dusk. Section by section, with a farm jack and lengths of timber and an unsexy application of patience, the tower began to stand again. It leaned and groaned under its own weight, a tall complaint against time. From far away it looked like a monument to a single idea repeated until it became muscle. His brother came once, heavy in the way of men whose meals are regular and whose roofs don't leak. George stood with his hands on his hips and his eyes narrowed against a wind that smelled of iron filings. "You really think you can make that thing spin again?" he asked. The words tried to sound teasing. They sounded tired. Elias tightened a bolt until the wrench squealed. "There's wind," he said. "I figure that's a start." "Ghosts," George said after a silence. "You're chasing ghosts." "Maybe," Elias said. "Maybe ghosts chase us." They didn't argue. Brothers learn the limits of argument the way farmers learn the horizon, by walking it and returning unchanged. Days slipped into a sequence that only his dog understood. Hammer, grind, heat, cool. He built a small forge from brick salvaged behind the barn. The anvil's ring carried at night, a sound so pure that even the coyotes paused. Old plow blades learned new jobs as brackets. A wagon rim became a collar. Lengths of wire turned to arteries in a machine that had once forgotten how to live. His palms blistered, healed, and blistered again. He learned which fingers could be sacrificed to stubborn nuts, and which must be protected for the work to continue. When the first good wind of autumn bullied the valley, Elias stood beneath his half-risen tower and listened. The steel answered, not with motion, not yet, but with a deeper groan, a promise of friction finding its language. Rain stitched the horizon in diagonal lines. He stayed at the base, feeling vibration travel into the bones of the hill, and he did not move until the storm had walked past and its tail had dragged the last branch from the last tree. He slept very little that night and woke with a sense he could not name. He climbed the ladder at dawn with a lantern tied to his belt. From that height, the world arranged itself into shapes that made a new kind of sense. Fields as squares of patience, roads as lines drawn by compromise, rooftops as small arguments with weather. He ran a hand along the nacelle's seam and felt the cold more intimately than a person should feel anything that cannot feel back. It felt like the surface of a memory, resistant, then suddenly soft. Work changed shape as the tower rose. The problems grew meaner, closer to the heart. Bearings had seized into single, sullen cylinders. The generator's guts were a nest of chewed insulation and the brittle lacquer of old heat. Elias learned to coax rather than command. He warmed stubborn parts in the forge, bathed them in oil, and waited until metal remembered how to separate from itself. Stories gathered in town, as stories will. He had built the secret engine. He had lost his eyesight to welding and now navigated by some kind of farmer's sonar. He had sworn an oath to the wind on his wife's grave. None of it reached him in any useful form. He carried lanterns up the hill even when the sky was not yet fully dark, and from the road below those lights made a constellation that refused to obey the usual rules. One afternoon, a knot of boys stopped at the fence. They called to him with the fearless curiosity of children, asked if the big fan would ever whoosh again. He told them to keep back from the ladder, voice gentle, because gentleness was a better teacher than scolding. They climbed anyway, not to defy him, but to test themselves, and one slipped, skinned a knee, and went home with tears that stung Elias more than any insult. After that, he wired an extra barrier, not against malice, but against the casual courage of the young. Winter announced itself with a thin crust of frost that made each rung treacherous. He worked less in the worst wind, not because he feared falling, but because the cold turned metal into a lyre that promised strength and delivered fracture. Indoors, the house learned his new quiet, parts soaking in trays on the table, diagrams sketched on envelopes, the stove ticking as if keeping time for the whole effort. In the smallest hours, he sometimes imagined the tower speaking back, not with words, but with the clean syllables of tension and release. In those same small hours, the valley's laughter practiced a new trick. It wore the coat of concern. A preacher warned softly about the sin of pride without saying a single name. Parents told children not to go up Marlowe Road after dusk. A woman at the post office pressed a pie into his hands and asked, too quickly, whether he had thought about what would happen if it fell. Elias thanked her for the pie and said nothing about gravity. He fell once in late winter when the ladder shifted on a gust. The ground met him with the blunt honesty of earth. Pain sang a bright, convincing line through his ribs, and his shoulder refused to play any instrument for several days. He did what the body requires. He stopped. He watched the tower from his window as the light traveled across it from left to right, as birds tested its angles, as wind learned to thread the gaps he had recently closed. When he returned, he climbed slower and with a new respect for the distance between intention and ground. By the first shy weeks of spring, the tower was no longer a ruin pretending to stand. It stood. It did not yet turn, but its stance had changed from apology to promise. Elias cleaned the generator housing until the rags came away gray instead of black. He laced fresh copper where rodents had made theology owe. He no longer saw ruin when he looked at it. He saw a patient thing, half awake, listening for a call it had almost forgotten. The laughter from the town had grown fainter, replaced by the softer murmur of curiosity. He knew they still talked about him. He could almost hear it in the wind. But the edge of their mockery had dulled. There was a rhythm in his days now, steady as breathing. Rise, work, eat, work again, sleep. The rest of the world had drifted into irrelevance. Each morning he climbed the ridge with his tools slung over one shoulder, his dog trotting beside him until the slope grew too steep. The path had changed under his boots, packed hard by repetition, marked by oil stains and the faint glint of dropped screws. At the base of the tower, his workbench leaned beneath a tarp, its surface littered with wrenches, copper wire, bearings, and sheets of notes filled with crooked lines. He had begun to think in metal and current, his dreams stitched with the sound of bolts turning and wind sighing through steel ribs. The tower, for all its silence, had become a companion. He had learned its moods, the groan of its braces before rain, the hollow ringing in the heat of noon, the low hum that whispered through it when the night wind shifted north. He spoke to it sometimes without realizing, short, murmured phrases, half curses, half comfort. "Easy now," he'd say when a cable slipped, or "Hold steady, girl," when the wind pressed too hard. If anyone had heard him, they might have thought him mad, but the tower understood, or at least he liked to believe it did. Rebuilding the turbine's heart was work that required both tenderness and violence. The old generator had been gutted by time and rats. The copper coils were brittle as straw. Elias scavenged what he could, wire from an abandoned tractor, bolts from a broken plow, insulation stripped from a forgotten well pump. He built a small forge in the barn, the air thick with the smell of burning oil and iron dust. Sparks rose like fireflies each night as he hammered, bent, and cooled. It was a language of repetition, of hands learning to remember what textbooks never taught. Sometimes exhaustion would catch him unaware. He'd set down his wrench and find his fingers trembling, his breath shallow. The ache in his ribs from that winter fall still flared when he worked too long. But pain was just another kind of weather, predictable, endurable. He'd wait for it to pass and then continue. The valley below carried on in its indifferent way. Tractors droned, children played near ditches swollen with meltwater, and at night the lights of the town flickered against the horizon like a row of stubborn stars. Yet now, when people looked toward Marlow Ridge, they saw something different. The tower no longer leaned in defeat. It stood tall and deliberate, its new steel glinting whenever the clouds broke. Some said it was foolishness turned to sculpture. Others whispered that maybe, just maybe, the old man knew something they didn't. One afternoon, Elias was halfway up the ladder, tightening the bolts that fastened the lower joint of the nacelle, when he noticed a truck crawling along the road below. It stopped by the fence, dust rising around it. Two boys jumped out and ran closer. He recognized them as the preacher's sons, barefoot, sunburned, full of mischief. They stood by the gate, shouting up at him. "Mr. Marlow, did it work yet?" one called. "Not yet," he answered, his voice steady against the wind. "When it does, will it make lightning?" He smiled faintly. "Only if the wind asks nicely." They laughed, uncertain if he was joking. After a moment, they waved and ran back to the truck. Their laughter floated up the hill like something lighter than air. For a long time after they left, Elias stayed where he was, hand resting on the steel, listening to the echo of their voices fade into the fields. That evening, his sister came from 2 towns over. Clara Marlowe was a small woman with kind eyes and a spine carved from practicality. She brought food, stew in glass jars, fresh bread, and the scent of soap from her kitchen. She looked at her brother, at the grime under his nails and the deepening lines around his mouth, and said softly, "Eli, you're working yourself into the ground." He poured her coffee and sat across the table. The lamplight flickered between them. "Ground's where the roots are," he said. "You can't fix everything," she murmured. "Some things are meant to stay broken." He shook his head. "Not if the wind still blows." She sighed, realizing that argument had no weight here. When she left, she kissed his cheek and whispered, "Just don't let it take you with it." He watched her car's taillights disappear into the dusk, the sound of the engine fading like the memory of an easier time. After she was gone, the silence felt heavier. He went back to the ridge, lantern swinging beside him. The tower's shadow cut long and dark across the field. He worked late that night, his hammer echoing under the stars. Each strike was a heartbeat, each breath a vow. When he finally stopped, the wind had risen, brushing through the open frame with a low, searching hum. He stood still, eyes closed, and let the sound pass through him. It wasn't just air moving anymore, it was promise. Days bled into weeks. Progress came slowly, measured in inches and in failures. He burned through 3 sets of gloves and half a dozen drill bits. Once, a wrench slipped and split his knuckles open. He wrapped the wound in cloth and kept going. The blood on the steel dried black, blending with the rust. It felt right somehow, as though the tower demanded a toll for its rebirth. By late May, the generator housing was clean and reassembled. When he turned the shaft by hand, it gave a faint vibration, uneven but real. It was a small thing, a whisper of motion, yet it filled him with something close to awe. He leaned close, listening, and for a heartbeat thought he heard a sound deep within, a low hum, like the memory of breath. He spent the next days running cable from the tower down toward the farmhouse. The work was tedious but grounding. Each foot of wire was a thread sewing 2 worlds together, the silent steel giant and the dim heart of his home. The valley's people saw him carrying spools up the hill and shook their heads. "Old fool's building a trap for lightning," they said. "He'll burn his house down before he lights it up." He didn't answer. He had stopped listening long ago. When the first real storm of spring rolled in, he was ready. The sky darkened to the color of bruised iron. The wind rose in fits, dragging dust across the fields. Elias stood at the base of the tower, rain stinging his face, and watched the clouds churn above. The tower shuddered, its frame trembling against the gusts, and the air around it filled with static. He gripped the ladder and climbed, each step a defiance of age and reason. The higher he went, the stronger the wind howled. When he reached the platform, the world below blurred into gray. He crouched beside the generator housing, lantern flickering beside him, and waited. The storm pressed against the steel like a living thing. The sound of it was everywhere, a deep, rolling voice older than language. He closed his eyes and listened, as if the wind might speak words he could understand. Then, on instinct, he released the brake on the main shaft. At first, nothing happened. Then a groan, a long, aching creak, followed by a tremor that ran through the whole structure. Slowly, the inner assembly began to shift. The vibration deepened, steady and sure. Elias felt it through his hands, through the soles of his boots. The tower, after years of silence, was breathing again. The blades were still missing, but the heart had stirred. A hum rose from the generator, low and uneven, but unmistakably alive. He leaned closer, disbelief and joy warring behind his eyes. Lightning flared across the hills, painting the valley in white. In that flash, the tower looked whole again, its shadow stretching across the land like a promise kept. He laughed then, not loudly, but with the quiet wonder of a man who had seen the impossible. The storm roared, but it could not drown him out. By dawn, the valley lay soaked and shining. The air smelled of wet earth and renewal. Elias stood on the ridge, his clothes stiff with dried rain, and looked at the tower. The generator still ticked softly, cooling in the morning light. Beneath the skin of the steel he could feel it, the faint pulse of motion, the memory of last night's awakening. Down in town, no one yet knew what had happened. They still joked over coffee, still doubted. But on the ridge, a secret had been born. The wind had spoken, and Elias Marlowe had answered. He walked home through the wet grass, the sky brightening above him. His boots left dark prints that filled slowly with water. Behind him, the tower stood silent again, but not dead, never dead. That morning, when he lit his stove, he paused. The flame flickered blue and steady. The kettle began to hum, almost in tune with the rhythm he'd felt beneath his hands hours before. He smiled faintly to himself. The valley could keep its laughter. The wind had already changed sides, and for the first time in years, Elias Marlowe felt that he was no longer working alone. The summer sun came early that year, burning through the valley haze before the dew had time to think about rising. Wheat shimmered like beaten gold, and the air tasted of dust and iron. By now, everyone in the valley had heard that something strange had happened on Marlowe Ridge, that the dead windmill had moved during the last storm. Some laughed it off, others whispered about it at church or across store counters, but no one could say for certain what they'd seen because no one had been there except Elias Marlowe. He didn't mind their doubt. In fact, he preferred it. Faith was lighter when no one tried to help carry it. Every day, he woke before dawn, fixed his coffee, and went to the ridge. The path, once uneven and overgrown, had become a trail of purpose. Compacted earth, footprints like signatures, the smell of oil and wind mingling in the grass. The tower greeted him like an old friend, its steel skin still dark from rain. He began the hardest work yet, raising the blades. They were long, curved limbs of fiberglass and steel scavenged from another county's abandoned wind farm. He'd driven for 2 days in an old borrowed truck to fetch them, the blades tied down with rope and stubbornness. Getting them home was one thing, mounting them was another. Each blade weighed nearly a ton. He'd built a system of pulleys and braces by hand, measuring angles in chalk on the dirt, guessing at mathematics he'd never been taught. The valley would have called it foolish. He called it faith in physics. For days the wind was still, a mercy and a warning. He worked in silence, the sweat burning his eyes, his arms trembling from effort. Each bolt was an argument with gravity, each lift a gamble. At night, his lantern light traced slow circles on the steel as he guided the ropes through their pulleys, coaxing the blades upward inch by inch. The sound of the cables straining was almost human, a groan of exhaustion and determination combined. From the road below, people sometimes stopped to watch. There were fewer jokes now. Some leaned against fences, hats in their hands, just staring. A few brought sandwiches or water and left them near his workbench without a word. When one of the blades finally locked into place, the sound of the pin slamming home echoed across the fields. The watchers flinched. Elias simply exhaled. 3 blades, 3 promises, 3 chances for the wind to forgive him. It took nearly a month to finish. By the time he stepped back to see the tower whole, summer had ripened into its heavy golden prime. The valley shimmered under heat, cicadas thrumming like wires in the air. The turbine stood taller than any barn or church steeple, its arms poised like an offering to the sky. Even still, it seemed to breathe, a great creature waiting for the right gust to set it free. Elias didn't celebrate. He simply stood there for a long time, sweat drying on his skin, the sun flaring behind the blades. It wasn't pride he felt, not exactly. It was something quieter, something like peace after a long argument. But peace was short-lived. The valley's curiosity turned into restlessness. People who had once ignored him now came up the road in wagons or trucks to have a look. Children ran through his fields. Men leaned on his fences with the air of judges. One evening, as he worked by lantern light, a familiar truck rolled to a stop on the road below. The headlights painted long white scars across the wheat. Virgil Moore stepped out. He was a man whose boots had never known mud, whose words always came coated in a smile. The richest landowner in the valley, Moore owned half the feed store, the grain elevator, and most of the water rights. He'd been the loudest voice mocking Elias at the auction months ago. Now his tone was different. "Evening, Marlowe," he said, climbing the hill. His shoes sank into the soil, and that alone seemed to irritate him. "Quite the project you've built yourself." Elias didn't stop tightening the bolts. "Just patching up old mistakes." Moore chuckled, glancing up at the massive blades. "Old mistakes, you say? Looks to me like you've built something new. Folks down there can see it turning soon, maybe. You think it's safe? Don't want a blade coming loose and cutting through someone's field." Elias met his gaze, the wrench still in his hand. "You worried about safety now, Virgil?" "That's new." The smile thinned. "I'm worried about order. You get that thing spinning, you'll be drawing power. Power brings attention. Attention brings questions about permits, about ownership. You built it on county land once, leased to the council. You sure you've got a right to it?" Elias wiped sweat from his brow. "The county had 20 years to care. They left it to rot. I bought it fair." Moore looked around as though the land might agree with him if he stared hard enough. "Things like this, they don't belong to one man. If it works, it could help everyone. And you know, I've got the resources to make that happen. We could expand it, modernize it. You'd still be part of it, of course." Elias smiled faintly, the kind of smile that had no warmth at all. "The wind doesn't sign contracts." Moore's eyes cooled. "Just think about it," he said, turning back toward his truck. "You've done something remarkable. Don't ruin it by being stubborn." When his headlights disappeared down the road, Elias stood in the dark for a long time. The only sound was the whisper of air brushing past the new blades. He placed a hand on the tower's base. "We'll stay our course," he murmured. "The wind's not for sale." In the days that followed, he worked faster. He adjusted the generator, fine-tuned the bearings, checked every cable twice. He knew men like Moore. Their words were seeds of interference. Better to finish before the valley tried to claim his dream. By midsummer, the fields below shimmered in the heat, and the air carried the faint electric scent of storms gathering far away. The wind came less often now, but when it did, it was strong, coiled with the promise of rain. Elias felt it in his bones before it reached the ridge, the pressure dropping, the whisper of movement in the grass. That evening, clouds rolled in from the west. He stood beneath the tower, eyes fixed on the sky. The air grew heavy, humming like a held breath. When the first gust hit, the blades stirred, just slightly, like a sleeping creature shifting in a dream. Then again, stronger. Elias climbed to the platform, lantern swinging from his belt. The wind tore at his coat. He reached the generator housing and felt the vibration, faint, uneven, but alive. He released the brake. The blades turned once, twice, then caught the wind fully. The hum deepened into a roar, steady and full. The structure trembled beneath him, but it held. The sound filled the valley, a deep metallic hymn that rolled over the fields and down into the town. Dogs barked, windows opened. People stepped out onto porches, staring toward the ridge. They saw it, the tower of dead wind spinning against the storm. Elias laughed into the wind, a raw, triumphant sound torn from years of silence. Rain lashed his face, but he didn't move. The blades spun faster, the hum turning into a steady song. For the first time in decades, the machine had found its purpose. He stayed until lightning forked across the hills, illuminating the valley in flashes of silver. Then he locked the mechanism and began the descent, soaked to the bone but smiling. When he reached the ground, he looked back and saw the tower still turning, slower now, the rain gleaming along its edges. At the farmhouse, he wiped the mud from his boots and went inside. The air smelled of damp earth and oil. He lit a lamp and connected the cable that ran from the tower. The bulb flickered, then glowed. Warm, golden light filled the room. He stared at it for a long time, his reflection trembling in the glass. Outside, the wind roared, the turbine answering with a voice of its own. He could almost swear he heard it breathing. By morning, the storm had passed. The valley lay washed and shining, and word spread like wildfire. People claimed they'd seen the impossible, a dead tower spinning again, throwing light into a single farmhouse. Some laughed nervously, others crossed themselves, but no one could deny what they'd seen. And though Elias said nothing, every time he looked toward the ridge, he saw it turning still, slow, steady, alive. The valley had always believed in what it could see and mock what it couldn't. But now, for the first time in memory, the laughter had stopped. The wind had found its voice again, and it was whispering his name. By the end of that summer, the valley had begun to change its tune. Where once there had been laughter, now there was talk. Low, persistent, hungry talk that spread faster than any drought rumor. Elias Marlowe's turbine had not just spun, it had lit up. At first, the glow from his house was little more than a curiosity, a small, steady light among the patchwork of dark fields. But then came the outage. It began one hot evening when the valley's grid gave out, as it often did when heat clung too long to the wires. One by one, the town's lights went black, radios died mid-song, and the familiar hum of machinery fell into an eerie quiet. But on the ridge, Elias's house stayed bright, its single bulb burning like a lantern above a sea of shadows. People noticed. That night, families stood on porches, staring up toward the ridge where the great blades turned slowly in the moonlight. The next morning, trucks began crawling up Marlowe Road, carrying curious neighbors and cautious strangers. They arrived in twos and threes, farmers, mechanics, mothers with children clinging to their skirts. All of them wanted to see the miracle. Elias met them at the gate, wiping grease from his hands. He hadn't planned on an audience. "Mornin', Mr. Marlowe," one man said, removing his hat. "Heard you've got power." Thought maybe our freezer could borrow some, Elias. Looked past him at the line of trucks and faces. He hadn't yet considered sharing. The system was crude, barely balanced, enough for his house, maybe a barn light. But the desperation in their eyes reminded him of long nights by candle and the bitter smell of burnt kerosene. He nodded slowly. "Bring what cable you've got," he said. "We'll see what the wind can spare." By noon, wires snaked from his generator down the slope like veins, connecting to half a dozen houses at the edge of town. When the current reached them, porch bulbs blinked awake, and someone shouted, "It's working!" The cheer carried through the valley like birds startled into flight. Word spread faster than the wind itself. Within a week, 10 homes were drawing light from the ridge. Within 2, the entire northern quarter of the valley glowed at night with a patchy, uneven brilliance. From a distance, it looked like fireflies had settled among the farms. Elias didn't charge anyone. He couldn't have explained why if asked. Maybe it was pride, or stubborn kindness, or some deeper obligation to the wind that had answered him. He spent his days checking lines, fixing fuses, balancing loads. At night, he sat on his porch, listening to the low, constant hum of the turbine and the laughter rising faintly from houses that had been dark for too long. But not everyone was pleased. Virgil Moore returned, this time with company, a pair of men in clean shirts and county badges. They arrived unannounced one morning, their truck crunching up the drive. Elias was working by the tower when he heard them call his name. "Mornin', Mr. Marlowe," Moore said, smiling like a knife. "Brought some folks from the council. Thought we'd talk about your little operation." Elias climbed down the ladder, wiping sweat from his brow. "It's not an operation," he said. "It's a tower that works." The taller of the two officials, Henderson, his badge red, cleared his throat. "Sir, we've had reports that you're distributing electrical power without authorization. That raises safety and liability concerns. Not to mention, technically, it's illegal." Elias looked from one face to the next. "Illegal to fix what the county abandoned?" "That's not the point," Henderson said, his tone slipping into practiced politeness. "You're transmitting current across private property. If someone's hurt—" "No one's been hurt," Elias interrupted. "Not yet." Moore stepped forward, hands folded like a preacher's. "Eli, no one's saying shut it down. But if you let us handle it, regulate it, upgrade it, We can make it bigger. You'll have resources, technicians, proper maintenance. You'd still get credit, of course. Think of it as cooperation." Elias stared past them at the spinning blades, their tips flashing white in the sunlight. "You mean control?" Moore's smile didn't move. "We mean progress." He felt the weight of years pressing on him then, the same years in which the county had watched this tower rot, the same mouths now speaking of progress. "The wind doesn't belong to you," he said quietly. "It never did." The officials exchanged looks. "We'll have to file a report," Henderson said. "There'll be a review. Might be fines involved." "Do what you have to," Elias replied. He turned and walked back toward the tower, the conversation already behind him. That night he found the first of the sabotage. A cable near the base had been cut clean through, not torn by wind or animals, cut. He repaired it in silence, lantern light flickering on the blade of his pliers. The next morning he found graffiti on his fence. "Wind thief." The town's mood had shifted. For every home grateful for light, there was another that resented the noise, the hum, the attention from outsiders. Fear crept in where curiosity had been. People liked miracles only when they came with guarantees. Still, Elias refused to stop. If anything, he worked harder. He rebuilt the support struts, reinforced the housing, and began sketching plans for a second, smaller turbine. The wind was strong that month, constant as breath. Each time the blades turned, he felt the rhythm steady his hands, a pulse that told him he wasn't wrong. Then came the storm. It rolled in without warning, a black wall of wind and rain that split the sky open like cloth. The air turned cold and electric. Elias was on the ridge when the first gust struck, nearly throwing him off balance. He grabbed the ladder, shouting over the roar, but the storm didn't care for human voices. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the tower in bursts of blinding white. Down in the valley, lights flickered and died as lines overloaded. People fled indoors, windows rattling. But on the ridge, Elias stayed. He could feel the turbine fighting the storm, its great blades straining against the furious wind. The hum rose into a scream. Something cracked. Sparks flew from the generator housing. He knew he should lock the brake, shut it down, but instead he climbed. The rain stung his face like sand. Each rung was slick, each gust a threat. When he reached the top, he threw himself against the hatch, forcing it open. Inside, the machinery roared, a furious heartbeat of metal and current. He gripped the controls, muscles burning. "Easy now," he shouted into the noise. "You've carried us this far. Don't break now." Lightning struck somewhere close. The shock rattled the tower like a drum. He felt it vibrate through his bones. Then, for a moment, everything went white. When he came to, he was lying at the base of the tower, rain pooling around him. His vision swam, and his ears rang with silence, the sudden, total silence of a stopped machine. Above him, the blades hung motionless against the storm-torn sky, steam rising from the generator like breath fading in cold air. He pushed himself upright, every bone protesting. The smell of ozone and burnt oil filled his lungs. For a long time he just sat there, drenched and shaken, watching the tower smoke. He didn't know if it could be repaired again, or if he had anything left to give it. But as the rain eased and the thunder rolled away, a faint sound reached him. Not a hum, not a whir, just a single, soft creak. One blade moved, then another. Slowly, stubbornly, the turbine turned again, its rhythm uneven but alive. Elias laughed weakly at first, then louder until the sound carried over the soaked fields. The wind had nearly killed him, but it had also refused to quit. By morning, the sky was clear. The town woke to find their lights still burning, their power unbroken. The ridge stood smoking but victorious. And in that dawn light the valley finally understood. The old man's tower was no madness at all. It was defiance given form. But Virgil Moore wasn't done. As the sun rose, he stood at his window in town, staring toward the ridge. His reflection hid his expression, but the line of his jaw was sharp and cold. "Let him have his moment," he said to no one. "Soon enough, the wind will blow our way." Elias Marlowe's miracle had survived the storm. But the next one was already gathering, and this time it wouldn't come from the sky. Autumn came quietly that year, slipping into the valley without the usual fanfare of wind or color. The wheat had been harvested, the air grew dry and brittle, and the nights stretched longer. From the ridge, the fields below looked like a map of gold fading to gray. The turbine still turned, steady as a heartbeat, its song echoing softly through the cold evenings. For a time, the valley lived in uneasy peace. Lights shone where darkness once ruled, powered by the stubborn wind that refused to die. Children studied under bulbs instead of candles. Fridges hummed through the night. People no longer laughed at Elias Marlowe when they passed him on the road. They nodded, awkward and respectful, unsure how to greet the man who had turned air into light. But where gratitude spread, envy followed. Virgil Moore had not forgotten the day the councilmen left Marlowe Ridge empty-handed. He had spent the summer gathering papers, permits, claims, loopholes, anything that might turn principal into possession. And now, as the first frost settled over the valley, he arrived again, this time not in his polished truck, but in a convoy of county vehicles. Elias heard them before he saw them, engines grinding up the dirt road, tires throwing pebbles. He stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, and watched the dust rise. The wind had fallen still, as if holding its breath. Moore climbed from the lead truck, wearing his usual smile. Behind him, a man in a brown coat carried a clipboard thick with forms. "Mornin', Eli," Moore called. "You've been busy." Elias said nothing. "We're here on official business," the man with the clipboard began. "Under county regulation, any energy-generating structure connected to multiple properties falls under public jurisdiction. Effective immediately, your turbine is to be decommissioned until proper licensing is secured." Elias let the words hang between them. "Decommissioned," he repeated slowly, as though tasting the word. "You mean taken?" Moore spread his hands. "Call it shared, if that helps you sleep. The people have a right to reliable power, Eli. You can't keep the whole valley on your shoulders. Let us handle it." "The county had 20 years to handle it," Elias said. The wind waited for no one. "Be reasonable," Moore pressed. "You've done something incredible." "But miracles aren't meant to be private property." Elias looked up at the tower. Its blades turned lazily in the pale light, whispering above them. "Then, maybe you should have built your own miracle." Moore's face hardened. "I'm not asking." The officials moved forward, unfolding a set of tools and ladders. One of them began unwinding the cables that led down to the houses. Another reached for the generator housing. Elias stepped in front of him. "No one touches it," he said quietly. The man hesitated, looking at Moore. "Sir?" Moore sighed. "You heard the order." Elias's voice didn't rise, but something in it carried weight. "You lay a hand on that machine and you'll answer to me." There was no threat in the words, only conviction. But conviction, when spoken by a man who had rebuilt a tower with his bare hands, carried more power than anger. The workers stepped back. Moore frowned. "Eli, don't do this," he said. "You'll make it worse." "Maybe," Elias said, "but at least it'll be mine to make." He turned and began climbing the tower. The officials shouted, the wind picking up around their words. Moore cursed under his breath. "Stop him!" No one moved. They only watched as the old man climbed, slow but sure, higher and higher until he stood on the platform, a dark silhouette against the whitening ski. The wind began to rise, as if answering his ascent. He reached the control housing and unlocked the brake. The blades shuddered, caught the wind, and began to turn. Faster, louder. The hum deepened into a low thunder that rolled across the valley. Down below, cables trembled, lights in distant homes flicker into life. Moore shouted something lost in the wind. Elias looked down at him, face calm, almost gentle. "This was never about power," he said. "It was about light." The first snowflake of the season drifted past his hand. He smiled. Then the storm hit. The wind roared without warning, a sudden gale tearing through the valley. The officials stumbled back as dust and ice whipped through the air. The turbine spun faster, too fast, its song turned into a shriek. Elias gripped the railing, shouting over the storm, "Hold on, girl!" Lightning flashed, striking the ridge in a blaze of white. The world became noise and motion. The tower groaned, its joints screaming in protest. One of the officials yelled for him to come down, but Elias didn't hear. The brake was locked open. The mechanism jammed by the surge. He worked by feel, fingers raw and bleeding, trying to free it. Another flash of lightning split the sky. For a heartbeat, everything shone. Elias, the tower, the valley below, and then darkness. When the storm passed, dawn came pale and hollow. The turbine stood still, its blades frozen mid-turn. Smoke drifted from the generator. The ground around it was scorched. They found Elias at the base, lying in the grass, his hands still blackened with oil. His eyes were closed, but there was no fear in his face, only rest. The town buried him on the ridge, beneath the tower he'd resurrected. For days, people came to lay flowers, to stand in silence before the great machine. Some prayed, some wept, others just stared, wondering if the wind would ever turn again. Weeks passed. Winter deepened. The turbine remained still, its blades coated in frost. The valley's lights dimmed once more, the nights growing long and empty. And then, one cold evening, a breeze rose. It began as a sigh, then a whisper, then a steady push. The blades creaked, resisted, and finally moved. Slowly, then faster. The tower groaned but held, its heart finding rhythm once more. Lights flickered across the valley, one by one, until the darkness was gone. From the town below, people looked up and saw the turbine turning under a sky of stars. It was as though the ridge itself had chosen to remember him. The children of the valley grew up hearing the story, how an old farmer had built light from rust and wind, how he defied storms and men alike, how the tower on the ridge never truly died. On quiet nights, when the wind was just right, some swore they could hear a voice in the hum, a calm, steady whisper saying, "Easy now. Hold steady, girl." And so it went. The wind, the tower, and the legend of Elias Marlowe, the man who gave the valley back its light and never once asked for anything in return. The turbine still turns, the valley still shines, and the wind still carries his name.